Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
St. Louis Public Radio's The Gateway gives you the day's news first thing every weekday morning. From the ever-evolving relationship between St. Louis City and County to developments in the Missouri and Illinois state capitals and reports from our correspondents in Rolla and the Metro East. We put it all in a roughly 10-minute package with clarity and context. Download The Gateway wherever you get podcasts.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
Do you ever think about the road not taken, how different our country would be if the capital had ended up being St. Louis, Missouri?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually asked that of the historians that I spoke with, and they seem to think that it might be pretty good in a lot of ways, that it is sort of lopsided, that we do have so much institutional power of all kinds on the coasts now, and that if you did have the seat of government in the middle, it might sort of counterbalance that to some extent.
So do you think, here you are talking to us today, you've written this great story about this. Do you think we can start a movement that we can restore St. Louis to the place it should have been?
It's a great idea. I'd love to see people work on that.
I notice you're not volunteering yourself for this at this point. I'm Sarah Fensky. Why should a nation that sprawls from the Atlantic to the Pacific have its capital on the eastern seaboard? It's a reasonable question now, but to many Americans, it felt even more pressing in the years following the Civil War. After all, traveling from the frontier to Washington, D.C. took not hours, but days. Some people unhappy with the capital's location came up with a bold idea to move the capital to St. Louis. That oft-forgotten piece of history is the focus of a fascinating news story in Smithsonian Magazine. And joining us today is its author, Livia Gershon. Livia, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on.
So take us back to the 1860s and 70s. What made St. Louis at the time seem like a better alternative to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, well, it's a number of reasons. One is that people were not too happy with how Washington, D.C. was at that time. It was kind of a mess. It was there were lots of mosquitoes. The streets were dusty part of the year and muddy the other part of the year. And people had been complaining about this for a long time. So there were moves in Congress to fix that and to put a lot of money into fixing up Washington, D.C. And I think that spurred some people to say, wait, why should the capital be here at all? Given that the country, so there's so much happening in the West, and many people felt like that was sort of where the future of the country was.
And St. Louis at that point was a city that was just growing leaps and bounds.
Yeah, absolutely. It was huge. It was much bigger than D.C. at the time, and growing very, very fast. And just to some people seemed to have much more dynamism than the East Coast.
So the part of your story that really amazed me, there's so much great history you uncovered here, but the part that just blew my mind, they were going to move not just the seat of government, but they were going to move the buildings themselves. What was the thinking with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know how many people took that like 100% seriously, but definitely some people did. They wanted to take the buildings apart and number them block by block and send them by railroad. And I think one thing that speaks to is just the sense of possibility with the Civil War had opened up so much new logistics that people were doing all kinds of things by railroad. And they kind of thought, well, why not? Why not just move all these Capitol buildings and send them off to halfway across the country?
And did they ever get very far in the logistics of this? I mean, it seems like it would be something that would be so difficult to do.
It didn't get all that far. There was a number of bills that were in Congress to potentially move the capital either actually to St. Louis or somewhere in the Mississippi Valley was how it was phrased in some of them. But the one that did the best of that did fail in a 77 to 97 vote. That was in 1868.
77 to 97. I mean, that's closer than you might think.
It was close. And apparently people on the East Coast were absolutely flabbergasted. They didn't believe that could happen at all. But it was people in the West and in other parts of the country that thought maybe D.C. was not the place anymore.
We're talking today to Livia Gershon. She's a freelance writer. She wrote this story for Smithsonian Magazine. It's such a hoot. You have to read this thing to really appreciate all the great details she has. We have that linked on our website. We've also put it out on our Twitter if you want to give that a look. Livia, part of what I love about this is you also wrote about some of the boosters and the backers who wanted to make this happen. You had a guy that you spent a little bit of time on who just sounds like a hoot. This is Logan Uriah Rivas. He was one of the most outspoken supporters of this plan. Who was this guy?
Yeah, he was apparently a real character and was just incredibly had a strong position for this idea. And he apparently was a very interesting looking guy. He had a long, messy red beard, and he walked bent over a cane because of a childhood illness. He had actually tried to be a school teacher, but the kids laughed at him so much that he failed in that career.
Oh.
So then he went to St. Louis and decided to start a newspaper and become this booster for this idea of moving the capital. He had the idea that the U.S. would eventually stretch not just all the way to California, but also up to Alaska, down all the way through Mexico. He just thought that St. Louis was going to be the center of an enormous United States that was going to cover the entire continent.
This guy sounds like he definitely had a way with a phrase. He called St. Louis the great vitalizing heart of the republic. And then you have this great contrast with how he saw D.C. He wrote that Washington was a, quote, distant place on the outskirts of the country with little power or prestige. And we might laugh this off. I think St. Louis is somewhat inclined to boosterism. But the publisher, or the editor of the Chicago Tribune, he was in favor of this.
Yeah, and I think some people had thought, well, maybe Chicago would be a good place to have a capital, but he said, no, Chicago will get enough benefit if it's in St. Louis, and St. Louis is in fact better suited to it. So yeah, it was kind of interesting that he got behind it, and that did seem to give the idea some momentum.
So I understand that the boosters, the people who wanted to bring this to St. Louis, they had an area in mind. This was the area that people would today know as the area near Jefferson Barracks. Did that have any impact on local property values at the point that this was a hot topic of discussion?
There was apparently some property speculation in that area, and it wasn't really a part of the city as such. It was kind of a less used area. It had been a Union Army training post, and so they thought this would be a great place for it. And there was a former congressman, Henry T. Blow, offered to donate 500 acres. He was a big landowner, and he offered to donate that, but in return, he was going to be able to build barracks for federal employees to live nearby. So he clearly saw himself as kind of building up this new property.
Sort of like a classic developer move, like, oh, I'm going to donate this land, but there's also a little bit of benefit for me there.
Exactly.
So part of what I thought was so interesting about your story is you're detailing all this interesting history. You also suggest that there was an element of racism in this suggestion that the capital should move to St. Louis. How so?
Yeah, there were a couple of different ways. One is that a lot of the backers were what was called at the time liberal Republicans, and that was sort of in contrast to the radical Republicans who were behind Reconstruction and really, had the vision that this was going to become a multiracial democracy. And liberal Republicans kind of said, well, that's not necessarily the direction we want to go, and instead sort of the better thing to do to move the country forward is to focus on westward expansion. So it was sort of a pushback from the idea of having a genuine multiracial democracy through Reconstruction.
And this ends up bringing in a name that is well known here in St. Louis, also a name well known in St. Louis, Joseph Pulitzer. He was part of this movement as well.
He was, yeah. And there were actually, I guess, a number of people who were involved who went on to have big careers in New York after the movement to move the capital failed. So it's sort of interesting that they kind of moved on from the city after that.
So this movement, it did fail. As you say, there was a congressional resolution on this. Two of them stalled out in the Ways and Means Committee. And then there is this one. This was introduced by a Wisconsin representative, February of 1868, came to a vote on the floor. And this was the vote you referred to, failed by just 20 votes here, 97 to 77. So as you said, that shocked some people back east. Was that the end of this idea at the point that they came so close and yet didn't get it?
That wasn't quite the end. The editorial from the Chicago Tribune editor actually happened a little bit later than that, but it did sort of fade away, I think, gradually, that people kind of realized that this was, in fact, not going to happen. And gradually more people backed off of it, although Rivas, who was just an absolute fanatic for it, apparently kept boosting the idea for quite a long time after that.
The newspaper publisher would not give up.
That's right.
So it's interesting, as you say here, the seat of government did not move here. We certainly didn't move the Capitol building, but the Army headquarters did. Was that tied into some of the same thinking here?
Yeah, for sure. And sort of the idea of westward expansion. And, of course, along with that is the genocidal policies against Native American nations was a part of what was going on. That one of the historians that I spoke with said that William Sherman actually felt freer to pursue a kind of military exterminationist policy from St. Louis than he did from Washington. So it does seem as though this was, he felt, a good place to conduct sort of some of the absolutely terrible Indian wars that were going on after the Civil War.
It was interesting, as you pointed out in the story. It was the same troops that pulled out of the South after Reconstruction. They ended up protecting the railroads in the West. Sort of a shifting of national priorities there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a idea that the way that this country is going to move forward is through bringing more white people and extracting more resources from the West, rather than sort of correcting some of the lack of democracy elsewhere in the country already.
Well, Livia, this story is so interesting. I have to say, here in St. Louis, it was passed around quite a bit. I think people were just intrigued by what you had unearthed. What first got you onto this subject?
My editor actually suggested the idea. I had not been aware of this, and I I reached out to a few people in St. Louis who I found out were also not aware of it. So it was interesting to find that out. Yeah, I was once I started looking at it, I was absolutely fascinated. I think it's such an interesting time in the history because there were it seemed like so many possibilities that people didn't know what direction the country was going to go in, or where its boundaries were going to be. All sorts of things were up in the air.
Yeah, I mean, now that you've sort of dug into this and you've talked to some experts about it and really plumbed this history, do you ever think about the road not taken, how different our country would be if the capital had ended up being St. Louis, Missouri?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually asked that of the historians that I spoke with, and they seem to think that it might be pretty good in a lot of ways, that it is sort of lopsided, that we do have so much institutional power of all kinds on the coasts now, and that if you did have the seat of government in the middle, it might sort of counterbalance that to some extent.
So even if the people who wanted to do this maybe weren't doing this for entirely good reasons, there might have been some good that had come out of it.
Yeah, I think so.
So do you think, I mean, here you are talking to us today, you've written this great story about this. Do you think we can start a movement that we can restore St. Louis to the place it should have been at?
It's a great idea. I'd love to see people work on that.
I notice you're not volunteering yourself for this at this point. And you're in New Hampshire, so it sounds like you might have a vested interest, and it's a lot easier for you if this stays in D.C.
That is true. I'm more of an East Coast person, sadly.
So this history has now come out, and as I said, I think this was passed around quite a bit here in the St. Louis area. Did you get much reaction in general for this story?
I didn't personally see all that much, although I do think there were people who were sharing it on social media, and it did seem to strike a note that it was just a sort of a quirky thing, especially, like you said, the image of bringing all these buildings on trains across so much of the country.
Yeah. So do you see anything here that you've learned that you find like you might want to follow up on for a story down the road?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this time period is just really a fascinating time. It's so interesting to see how places like St. Louis were growing so quickly and just changing so much. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
All right. Well, Livia Gershon, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.